It's my pleasure now to introduce the next speaker, Dr. Taylor Wallace, who is a professor in the Department of Nutrition and Food Studies at George Mason University and a principal and CEO at the Think Healthy Group. He serves as the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Dietary Supplements, and he's the deputy editor-in-chief of the Journal of the American Nutrition Association. He's also the author of a cookbook called Sizzling Science, and he operates a very popular food and nutrition blog. Dr. Taylor?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. You know, right before we started this session, I was saying that the Tea Symposia, when it was held out at USDA, was one of the first sessions I attended when I moved to Washington, D.C. over a decade ago, and it's always been a really rich program, and it's a real honor to present some of our data on the cardiometabolic benefits of tea here, I guess somewhat 10 years later. So these are my conflicts of interest. These are the ones that could be perceived for this presentation. All of my conflicts of interest are listed on my website at drtaylorwallace.com. And per this presentation, a lot of the data on the systematic reviews were funded by Unilever. So a little bit of background on tea and cardiometabolic disease. I won't go too in depth because I realize that most of you all are fairly familiar. Tea is a major source of flavonoids. We know that it's the second most consumed beverage worldwide, and that it has about 20 times the flavonoid. Consumers of tea have about 20 times the higher flavonoid intakes compared to those who don't. We also know that cardiometabolic diseases are the #1 cause of death worldwide and here in the United States. And those include cardiovascular diseases, diabetes, and chronic renal failure. And then we also know that there is a high variability in the flavin-3-all content of tea products, which makes it difficult to estimate average intakes in prospective cohort studies. I'm going to be showing you a lot of prospective cohort studies, but also right up front, I want to point out two really new cutting-edge studies that I think provide important evidence to the cardiometabolic benefits of tea. So first is a study published by Gunther Kugel's lab in the UK. And really, you know, this is novel because, as most of you all realize, large-scale observational studies rely on accurate assessment of dietary intake. Most of the other studies, or all of the other studies, in the peer-reviewed literature on flavin-3-all intake and cardiometabolic disease estimate flavin-3-all intake based on self-reported dietary data. And, you know, I'll tell you, a lot of these cohort studies do a dietary assessment maybe 1 or 2 times. This introduces substantial limitations that can severely affect outcomes. Now, biomarkers have the ability to help overcome some of these limitations and allow for more rigorous and more objective and accurate estimates of dietary intake. So using these biomarker estimated flavin-3-all intake, you can see that in women, see significantly lower systolic blood pressure and diastolic pressure. And to the right of your screen, you can see the hazard ratio and the 95% confidence intervals. Or I'm sorry, the decrease in blood pressure and the 95% confidence intervals, systolic blood pressure. Now, this study, this is a Mendelian randomization analysis, a 2-sample Mendelian randomization analysis. This is fairly new as well. This looks at ischemic stroke subtypes. It's unclear whether observations using nutritional epidemiology are influenced by confounding factors or even reverse causation. We've had this debate with nutrition epidemiology for quite some time now. Mendelian randomization analyses use genetic variants as instrumental variables. It's a genetic epidemiological method that helps avoid potential confounding variables and reverse causation. Now, Mendelian randomization is not a replacement for causation association study, but what these two studies presented to you offer to the peer-reviewed literature is consistency between different types of studies that were showing that these T-flavin-3-ols very much exert effects on cardiometabolic health. And in this study, a genetically predicted extra daily cup of tea consumption was associated with a 21% reduced risk in small vessel stroke. Now, flavin-3-ols or flavinols exert numerous effects on the cardiometabolic system. They can affect markers of inflammation, such as those NF-kappa B pathways, markers of oxidative stress, insulin and glucose dynamics, which I'll talk about towards the end of the presentation, capillary permeability, they're regulators of gene expression. They may have a potential effect on blood lipids, although this, according to our data, is not as clear as some of the others. Lipid peroxidation, which is a very important role in atherosclerosis development, and then substantial data showing effects on endothelial function and endothelial nitric. So dilation or measurement of the elasticity of the arteries. This is really important and a real emerging biomarker of health. And a fairly systematic review showed that about 2.6% improvement in flow-mediated dilation was shown for about 2 to 3 cups of tea consumption per day. And this is significant because systematic reviews have showed that just a 1% change in flow-mediated dilation has shown to reduce the risk of CVD by about 10%. So this is a fairly, striking number for a dietary intervention. Now, production of endothelial nitric oxide, we know that this allows for vasodilation. I always explain this to my kids in my Nutrition 101 classes. You kind of have to think of your arteries and veins as a rubber band, right? We don't want to get all that nitric oxide from smoking because then the rubber band stretches too far and, it can snap eventually. But we want that optimal circumference. We want that optimal dilation. And things like tea, fruits, and vegetables that have all these flavonoid compounds, these rich dietary bioactives, can provide vasodilation. At the same time, we see that endothelial nitric decreases platelet activation, adherence, and aggregation. Again, important for atherosclerosis and other cardiometabolic diseases. Now, we see a decrease in inflammatory leukocyte recruitment, and we see decreases in stress. All can contribute long-term to chronic disease development. Now, I'm going to jump into recent research, and we've done 2 systematic reviews and an umbrella review of systematic reviews since 2010 that we've published in the scientific literature. And then finally, I'm going to wrap up with a working group within the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics that I've been a part of for over a year now that will be publishing the first US-based guideline and intake recommendation for a bioactive, those being flavin-3-ols. And so I'll wrap up with that. So let's start with our first systematic review. This was a systematic review that looked at outcomes. So all-cause mortality, cardiovascular mortality, cardiovascular events like heart attack, and then also stroke events. We showed that most studies reported multiple outcomes of interest. 8 studies did not have sufficient data to be included in meta-analysis. And overall, we found that each daily each cup of daily tea consumption was associated with a 1.5% lower risk of all-cause mortality, 4% decrease in the risk of cardiovascular disease mortality, 2% lower risk of cardiovascular disease events, and 4% lower risk of stroke events. Now, this is, this is in the general population, the general healthy population. And what we found was that if you look in the above 65 population, which is right where most of these events and outcomes occur, you see a much stronger correlation, and the data has a stronger strength of evidence in certain instances. So this is the data on all-cause mortality, and what I can say is the gray to the left of the screen represents your 95% confidence intervals. And if you think about tea having about 200 to 250 milligrams of flavonoids, once you get up to that 1,500 milligrams or that 8 to 10 cups of tea per day, we really don't have a lot of good cohort data on that, right? Not many people consume that level of tea, so your confidence intervals begin to widen, and this doesn't mean that we showed an increased risk. We actually didn't see a risk of adverse events at all in this study, but it just means the confidence intervals start to get wider because there's less data. And you can see to the left of your screen, the overall hazard ratios, and these are broken down by male and female, both sexes, and so you can see the consistency among the data here. Same with cardiovascular disease mortality. Again, not a lot of data at the higher levels of intake because not many people are consuming that 8 to 10 cups a day. But again, benefits fairly consistent across the board in studies. These are cardiovascular events. Now you see fewer studies that are included in the systematic review and the meta-analyses, but still showing somewhat consistent results here. And then finally, stroke events. Again, not as much data at the higher levels of intake, but fairly consistent across the board if you look to the right of your screen and you look at those hazard ratios. Okay, so strength of evidence grading. Of course, we used all of the Cochrane tools and methods that are established by the National Academy of Medicine's recommendations around how to conduct a systematic review. And this is based on the evidence to date. This was published in July of 2020. So I believe the systematic review reflects to that date. We showed that and you should keep in mind that single components of the diet are likely to only show small effects. So when we talk about nutrition, we often like to, which is what this is, use a reductionist approach, right? But nutrition is really global, right? We don't just consume tea and that's all we, consume for the day. We consume a diet. And so small effects can add up to large effects cumulatively, especially over time. We see a greater number of events with increasing age, right? You see the moderate level evidence was in those 65 years and older. And that's because when you look at, healthy adult cohort studies, that may be age 20 to 70, you don't really see a lot of events, a lot of heart attacks occurring in the 20, 30, 40, and 50 population. And so it's really hard to tease that out. So the moderate effects are really shown in the older populations, which makes nutrition hard because we really want to preach prevention. So dietary patterns show much larger effects than these single components of the diet. And it's hard to tease out confounders again in these observational studies. Okay, so let's talk mechanisms. We talked mechanisms for a minute at the beginning of the presentation. Our second systematic review really looked at blood lipids and blood pressure. I've talked a little bit about endothelial function and improvements in blood flow, but there's also cross-communicating proteins that regulate inflammation, very important right now in the COVID-19 pandemic. And then, of course, we have seen that the diet very much influences the microbiome, and that the microbiome has this gut-brain connection, this gut-vascular connection. Our bodies are very well in communication with the gut microbiome, which has evolved with us to a great extent. Okay, so our systematic review on biomarkers, we found moderate evidence in healthy participants with total cholesterol. Now, keep in mind, few randomized control trials, you see 3, 5, 7 randomized control studies. Most of these studies were crossover studies, 10 to 20 people, so very small sample size that is likely insufficient to show modest effects on things like systolic and diastolic blood pressure and cholesterol levels or blood lipid levels. This is an area where we really need more research. We need a large randomized control trial because the data is very unclear here, and there's not enough statistical power, likely even within our meta-analysis, to show subtle effects of tea intake on these markers. So you can see here, none of the 3 randomized control trials reported significant changes in blood pressure among healthy participants, right? Another issue with nutrition research is if you've got normal blood cholesterol levels, it's really hard to show an improvement in people with already healthy levels of blood cholesterol. Now, if you look at people who are at risk or have cholesterol, you start to see more effects and more people responding. Again, this the blood lipid levels, you see HDL cholesterol, LDL, total cholesterol, and triglycerides. Again, not a lot of statistical power here in our meta-analysis to show one way or the other. This is our at-risk population. You can see things, again, not a lot of statistical power, but things starting to become a little more tighter and a little bit more data in this area. And if you look, at the T intervention kind of between the forest plot and just 2 columns or 3 columns from the left, you can see, very small sample sizes included in each study. So not a lot of statistical power here at all. So then we moved into an umbrella review, and this is a systematic review of systematic reviews for all intents and purposes. We found several high-quality systematic reviews and dose-response meta-analyses, and mainly population-based studies that supported beneficial effects on events and stroke events, including our own that I just presented. And we found medium to high quality systematic reviews that further elucidate potential benefits on other biomarkers of disease. I should say within our markers, there was a study, a Cochrane review by Hartley et al. in 2013 that did show beneficial effects of tea on LDL cholesterol levels. We did not find the same thing because we only looked at tea as a beverage. And a lot of the studies are on green tea extracts and green tea supplements. So the Cochrane review that was published in 2013 had a lot more statistical power than we did in our systematic review. However, our goal was to look at beverage tea intake. So based on this umbrella review, consumption of tea as a beverage did not seem to be harmful to health, and therefore the benefits of moderate consumption likely outweigh the risk. We found, again, that endothelial function and flow-mediated dilation seem to be enhanced. You see the same data that I presented at the front of this presentation. We're also going to be working to update this systematic review in the near future. And so hopefully we will have a much more highly statistically powered and more recent systematic review to provide to you next time the Tea Symposia comes around. We also found some interesting stuff on cross-communicating proteins that regulate anti-inflammatory NRF2 and pro-inflammatory nuclear factor kappa B or NFKB pathways. And there's a handful of high-quality systematic reviews that show that flavin-3ols regulate markers of inflammation. This was out when we published our umbrella review in Annals of Medicine. And what we really showed through all of these, systematic reviews and looking through all this data is really that adding 2 cups of unsweet tea to the diet can be a simple and cost-effective preventative healthcare approach for cardiovascular diseases. I should mention the Cosmos trial before I conclude today. This is a study of cocoa flavanols, but very similar compounds to tea, especially in regards to adverse events. This was a 2x2 controlled trial that just published last month of 500 milligrams a day of cocoa extract supplementation. It was shown to reduce cardiovascular death by 27%. We really need a randomized control trial that's sufficiently powered that looks at biomarkers and risk biomarkers of disease in this area that's specific to tea. And that small clinical trials of beverage tea and green tea supplements show differences in safety profiles. You see that supplements in particular can cause a rise in the risk of harm to the liver, and also some gastrointestinal discomfort, nausea, experience with high dose supplements. So our meta-analyses again are a beverage tea intake, and this would not advocate for high dose supplementation, although unlike some of my colleagues, I think there's enough evidence to say that low dose supplementation is fairly safe. But you do see a difference in these safety biomarkers between tea intake and supplements, particularly at higher levels where the supplements show much more of a harmful effect. I want to say by talking about the Nutrition and Dietetics clinical guideline on flavanols. This is something that our working on for over a year. At University of Alabama, Birmingham has been our fearless leader and chair in this task, and we'll be publishing those guidelines within the next 2 to 3 months. And I really wish that I could share those with you today, but I'm not able to. The only thing is I can review our very rigorous decision-making steps that we use to come to our recommendations around flavin-3ol intake, and to assure everyone that we did a very thorough safety review. We looked at all different types of evidence, even expanding past what I presented to you today, and that we have attempted to translate that evidence into a quantified bioactive intake statement for consumers and health professionals. You can find more information out at the Academy's website. That's eatrightpro.org. And so those are coming soon, and that is the end of my presentation.